Okay, we're recording now. So good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Angela with Marrone Bio Innovations. I head up the marketing communications with the organization, and I'm pleased to present to you today, along with my colleagues, biologicals and best practices for growing greenhouse crops. Today's webinar is 2 hours, and it is approved for various credits with different organizations. We have the California DPR, Pesticide and Regulation Department. We have the Oregon Department of Agriculture, Washington, and then also Certified Crop Advisors. So hopefully this is helpful for you. Take a screenshot of it. I'll be sending this information out in a follow-up email as well, so you'll have it. But you obviously want to make sure this is on file as you apply for those credits. If you have any questions, just post it in the chat. I'll share my email later, and then I think many of you already have my email, but certainly reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns about the credits. Okay, I'd like to now introduce my speakers. I do have a couple of colleagues online as well that are available for question and answer. So Lois Hopkins is representing the Pacific Northwest. And then I also have John Driver, who's representing the Midwest and has a tremendous amount, both of them have a tremendous amount of experience in greenhouse. And John Driver also has a lot of experience with PAA. So some of the products that we'll be talking about, Jet Ag and Jet Wash. If you have any specific questions about that, John is here and on the panel available to answer questions. Our presenters today are Steve Bogash, Dr. Matthew Brecht, and Nick Steenekin. So I'd like to go ahead and just give you a short introduction to each. So Steve Bogash began his career as an owner and operator of Greener Horizons, a garden center, nursery, greenhouse, and landscaping operation in Westminster, Maryland, before serving nearly 20 years as a horticulture educator and researcher for the Pennsylvania State University Cooperative Extension in State College, Pennsylvania. Since retiring from extension service, Steve joined Marrone Bio as our Northeast Mid-Atlantic Product Development and Territory Business Manager. His territory runs from Southern Virginia to Caribou, Maine, to the western edge of Ohio, and he oversees several dozen university and private research company product trials, as well as many on-farm demonstration trials for Marrone Bio Innovations. One of the most exciting things about this stage in my life, Steve says, is helping usher in the next wave of safe, effective biological pest management products. So Steve and his wife, Roberta, live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where he's honing his carpentry skills, building wooden boats, which I want to see a picture of, Steve. I love boats, and renovating their home near the, oh, I'm going to say this wrong, but the Susquehanna, say it?
Susquehanna.
Susquehanna, thank you, river built in 1933. So that is Steve, and he's going to be leading most of the webinar today. And then our PhD, Dr. Matthew Brecht, is going to be chiming in on some of the insights regarding some of the different diseases. So Matthew Brecht has a Bachelor of Science in Biology from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. He has a master's degree in plant pathology and a Doctor of Philosophy in Plant Pathology from the University of Florida. So Matthew is the founder of Dutch Valley Farms, a Tier 1 indoor cannabis grow operation in Estacada, Oregon. He is a dynamic and experienced sales and research professional with over a decade of experience with Syngenta, and he now leads our cultivated garden division at Marrone Bio Innovations. So Matt truly is an expert in cultivated garden and plant pathology, along with Steve. And so they are here to answer all of your questions about the diseases we're going to cover today in the specific environment of greenhouse growing. So Steve and Matt, thank you for being speakers. And then I have my colleague in California here, Nick Steenekin. He's going to be speaking on the laws and regulations portion of the presentation. Nick was born and raised in Temecula, California, and has always had an interest in agriculture, animals, and nature. His passion for agriculture led him to Cal Poly Pomona, where Nick graduated in 2018 with a plant science degree and a minor in integrated pest management. Upon graduating, Nick worked for a large commercial cannabis greenhouse facility. While working at the greenhouses, Nick saw the need for more professionalism and education within the industry, leading him to earn his PCA and QAL licenses. In December of 2019, Nick met Marrone Bio's Matt Brecht at MJ BizCon, which is a big convention for the cannabis industry. And shortly thereafter became a sales intern at Marrone Bio and was just recently promoted to the Northern California Territory Sales Manager position. So Nick, over the last 8 months of being at Marrone Bio, has filled in, called on hemp and cannabis growers, assisted with pacesetter demo trials in the Midwest, and has been a huge help in a lot of the webinars. And you're going to see the presentation he put together near the end. So just a huge passion for education in this area of the agriculture industry. So Nick, thank you so much for being on the webinar and contributing to the important safety talk.
Happy to be here, thank you.
With that, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to hand this over to my colleague, Steve Bogash, who's going to introduce Marrone Bio to you a little bit, and then we'll introduce some of the best practice videos that we're going to be sharing with you today. So go ahead and take it away, Steve.
Thank you very much, and good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are located. So first, this is our safe harbor statement. Marrone Bio is a publicly traded company, and it's important that if you are going to take an interest in our company and invest, make sure that you do all the due diligence. This is a very long statement that basically says, buyer beware, make sure that you are doing all the research that you need before you jump into making that investment. I think, can I move forward? Oh, okay, you got this. So about the company. So the Marrone Bio was founded in 2006. The IPO on the NASDAQ was in 2013. And Dr. Pam Marrone is our founder. And Pam is actually on the call today. This is kind of interesting. I just saw that she was saying hello to everybody. This is one of the major reasons that I came to work for Marrone Bio is there's a magnetism in the company that was created by Dr. Marrone, and you can feel it in everything that we do, the ethics, the morals, the way the company operates. I'm just past my 3 years and enjoy it thoroughly here. We're based out of Davis, California, but manufacturing is in Bangor, Maine at our M manufacturing facility. We have nationwide sales and technical support with global distribution, over 500 worldwide patents, and our library has over 18,000 microorganisms in it. Recently, Kevin Helash took over as CEO, and we're really looking forward to seeing the direction the company takes now with Kevin in charge. So this is our product portfolio at this point. Regalia. Regalia is what the company was built on, and it's one product that I have handled many times during my research career. Magistine, which is our bio-nematicide and soil insecticide. Stargus, one of our more recent products. Stargus is a bacillus product, very effective on downy mildew with powdery mildew and a number of other attributes. We'll be talking about Stargus later. Pacesetter, one of our newest introductions, primarily designed for the row crop market, corn and soybeans. Haven reduces sun and heat stress. It is a coconut oil extract and does a really nice job preventing sunburn on quite a number of crops. Venerate XC and Venerate CG. Venerate is an insecticidal bacteria, really interesting modes of action. Same with Grandivo. It is another biological, another bacterial material. This is a dry material. It's a water dispersible granule. It's been around it's one of the older products that Marrone has. I've been using it in research for quite a number of years. And then JetAg and JetOxide, our peracetic acid, or also known as peroxy products. So let's get right into it. It was my great pleasure to visit Peachtree Farms on September 23rd to 25th. This was a follow-up from an idea that I had when I visited and watching them scout. So I'm going to let the video speak, and we'll come back to them afterwards and talk about what we've seen in each of these videos. Take it away, Angela.
Hi, I'm Steve Bogash, Northeast Territorial Business Manager with Marrone Bio. I cover from Southern Virginia to Maine and from Western Ohio to New Jersey and Delaware. I'm here at Peachtree Farms in Upper Bucks County, Pennsylvania, very near the New Jersey-Pennsylvania border. Peachtree Farm has long been a leader in biological pest management, and they've always been willing to share their knowledge with other growers. The operation was originally created by Lloyd and Candy Traven in 1983, and since that time, their son Alex Traven has been an integral part of their operation, and he now operates as their head grower. Peachtree creates and grows a wide variety of organic herbs, flowers, and other plants. Alex has been willing to give us a look under the hood here at Peachtree and share with us their scouting and IPM operation.
Steve, you're on mute. Okay.
Yep. So that's where we are. We're going to be at Peachtree Farms. I have often taught with Alex and Lloyd in various iterations, and we wanted this whole webinar to be a little different rather than the typical voiceover PowerPoint. So this one's going to be very video driven. And so here's a conversation with Lloyd Traven, the co-owner of Peachtree Farms.
So, Lloyd, one of the more interesting things about your operation is watching how it's morphed over the years. When I first met you, you were selling a lot of begonias. Mm-hmm. You were supplying Philadelphia Flower Show, and herbs were a small part of your operation. Things have changed a lot. So what's brought about this huge change?
Well, it's always been a part of the operation because we've been growing herbs since our very first year. That was 1983.
Were they organic then?
They were not organic then, and that part of it's an interesting story. But we were very, very focused on building the ornamentals part of the business. We thought that that's where the bigger margin, the bigger money was going to be. And so we pushed that and developed some very cool products over time. And when COVID hit this year, it changed everything for us. We went organic in 2008, which was a big move for us, a great move for us, but we never really leveraged it. This year, because we looked at it and said the only people who are going to be allowed to be open are going to be people who sell food. That we really thought that no garden center across North America would ever open up their doors to customers this year. And so we made an immediate switch over where we said we're going to sacrifice all of the ornamental plants that we had propagated and were ready to plant because we're never going to have a chance to sell them until May, June, July, whatever. And we made a complete switch to organic vegetable plants and more organic herbs. And we literally overnight made the change and could not keep it in stock. People wanted local, they wanted organic, they wanted their own gardens, they wanted to plant their own food because it's the only thing that they had any control over at that time.
So I know that you are a grower partner with Wegmans. Is that what the expression?
We're a partner farm.
Partner farm with Wegmans. So how important has Wegmans been in that, and do you have other outlets for your organic herbs as well?
We continue to have our other normal organic herb business, which has grown tremendously as well. Wegmans gets a very specific product that is sold only through them. That's the agreement we have with them, is that product is a Wegmans exclusive.
And I do see your 4-inch basil in my local Wegmans store. I have used a bit of it.
That's good. We're glad to hear it, and we appreciate the support. But so we do have other outlets, but the key thing for Wegmans is that, first of all, they support us, they're loyal, and they give us business twice a week, 52 weeks a year. It's every week of the year we ship to Wegmans. And for a greenhouse, that's the holy grail, to have regular cash flow in the summer, in the fall, in the dead of winter, not just springtime.
So in some of the work I've been doing with your son, Alex, we've seen the efforts that you guys go to make sure that some of the beneficial insects you use don't last till they get to the store. You try and get as many off as possible. Obviously, that's not going to be 100%. So consumers, my experience with consumer is a bug is a bug. How has that worked out at the store level, both Wegmans and also garden centers, because they must encounter the occasional bug?
So it's a lot easier with garden centers because they're used to talking to customers about insects. It's part of their regular thing. And we've gotten to the point with some of our customers where they will use the presence of a beneficial as a selling point. So they'll point it out to their customers and say, you get an extra benefit, you take this home with you to your garden. And I will also say that that's not the norm. That's a pretty enlightened garden center.
Sure.
It's an issue because I remember talking to Bill Calkins about this, and I said, well, we should be advertising this fact that we're using all biologicals, all these biorationals and biocontrol agents. And he said flat out, you never market the fact that you have bugs on your plants. You just don't do it. And while we think it's a great thing, the consumer, Mrs. Smith, does not like that. And Wegmans has a zero tolerance policy on insects, and they don't care. An insect is an insect is an insect, and somebody's going to complain about it. So what we've come up with is a system where when the plants are on the bench and they take a flat that they're going to package, we take blowers and we blow those plants off with an electric blower to stir the insects off of them, drop them into the sleeve, cart them and put them in the building until we then put them unboxed on our truck overnight. So we're chilling them down a little bit, take the field heat off. We're giving those insects a chance to escape, to move on. They don't want to be cold, and they don't want to be in a sleeve. They want to fly, they want to live. Then the next morning, we blow them again, box them, palletize them, blow the pallets off, put them finally on the truck. And then it goes directly to Wegmans from there. And again, they look at every pallet and they're looking for fungus gnats and things like that. So we figured that this process that we go through, it's a lot of extra steps. What was happening was you would open the box and whatever was stuck in there overnight would fly out. That's all they saw, and they would reject an entire load because of that.
Gotcha.
So
now let's shift gears a little bit, and this is a very COVID-19 kind of a question. So that's going to make this interview very timely. Things have changed a lot for your operation since pre-COVID. I know the crystal ball's got to be really hard to look into now, but we're all trying to think post-COVID as well. With all the growth that you've done, where do you see this just being a continual march in this direction? Or is this just a way you're doing it now and you see something different after we get on the other side of this virus?
I think sales-wise and marketing-wise, 2021 is going to look a lot like 2020 in terms of sales. The past is gone for right now, for a long time. So we've made that switch. So we are now nationally known as the organic source for retail-ready vegetables and herb plants that can be shipped palletized all over the country. And we don't see that changing. People are still going to be avoiding all the public interaction. They're going to be avoiding people as much as they possibly can until we're on the other side of this. We're going to be so firmly established at that point in doing what we do that I don't think there's any going back to what we were doing. We're making a conscious decision now that we will entertain and look to produce any vegetable, herb, organic, sustainable type crop like lavender before we will do a typical ornamental. And so all of a sudden, where everything used to be about the flower, now it's going to be about the green.
And possibly the fruit.
And the fruit as well.
I know you all already do some figs. I don't remember ever seeing like ever-bearing strawberries.
We do strawberries in the spring.
So you do strawberries as well? The ever-bearing types, or just okay, ever-bearing types. Blueberry plants?
We don't.
Not
takes too long.
Okay, too long of a cycle. Okay, so you see this as the sustainable part of your operation?
Sure.
And without sharing any of the big secret, because you've always been really strong about introducing the next big thing, what can you share which is going to be the next thing you're going to be trying?
Well, we've got two that we're coming out with this year, actually. One of them is a brand new lavender that we are really excited about, and the response in the marketplace has been just crazy.
What's the name of it?
It's called Sensational.
Okay.
And it really is sensational. It's really special.
What's different about it?
It has the stiffest, straightest flower stem I've ever seen on a lavender, and also the heaviest, thickest flower I've ever seen on a lavender. It literally, you can take it and you can shake it and it doesn't move. It just is standing up straight. It's the best cut flower I've ever seen.
Still draws pollinators?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. And hardy.
Sure.
So it's an intermedia, a hybrid, sterile, doesn't reseed itself. It's a really good plant, and it looks good even when it's not in bloom. It's got a really nice foliage to it.
So you said two, that's the lavender.
Yeah. We have a fig that we're introducing. We love our figs, and we're at a point now where we grow enough figs in the upper greenhouse that I'm tired of eating figs. I mean, I'm done. And I have some that have been sitting in the fridge for about a week now, and it's just like, not ready for it anymore.
My wife would find you're getting tired of figs blasphemous.
I know, I totally understand it. And but anyway, we have a new one, and its name is Phenomenal, and because we have a lavender phenomenal, of course. This plant, the plants that we have in the upper range right now are almost 4 years old. They're only this tall, 24 to 30 inches tall, and about the same spread on them. And if they have leaves, they have figs on them. Wow. It's crazy, and they ripen here. And so this is a plant that we're positioning. It's a true dwarf. We're positioning this as a plant that's going to be in every condo, every apartment, college dorms when they're open again, on tabletops. It's going to be heavily marketed. It's just a crazy good plant.
Awesome. Hey, well, thanks for a look under the hood for where things going.
Sure thing.
Take care, Lou.
Pleasure
Thank you very
seeing you.
much.
So now we're going to start getting into the meat of this particular webinar. And just for everybody who's here, we had so much material from these video interviews with Alex and Lloyd that we split this up. This one is going to focus more on disease management, and the next one is going to focus on insect and mite management. And Angela, do we have a date yet for the next one? I know we were throwing some dates around.
Yes, I was hoping to have a date finalized by today's webinar, but we don't. However, we'll probably be finalizing that within the next 24 hours. So for those of you that are interested in watching that follow-up webinar, it's going to be mid-January, probably the week of January 11th or January 18th. And I will make sure to send out an announcement as soon as that webinar date is finalized, so you all can pencil that in on your calendar.
So you'll see the other half of all the video work that we shot here.
Yes.
So let's get into the meat of this with Alex. So Alex Traven is the head grower. All of this started when I was visiting Peachtree one day, and I was watching some materials come in off of the cart, and Alex was doing an intensive inspection of them before they got anywhere near their production house. So let's move on with the next video with Alex. So we're going to start off with cleaning here. Okay.
Before applying the Jet Ag and Jet Wash, we recommend a pre-step, which is removing any debris or organic matter on the contact surface. This can be done with a brush and vacuum if plant material is nearby, or if not, power washing works as well. This improves contact and penetration for the disinfection surface. Now we are mixing the Jet Ag and Jet Wash. The rate is 7.8 ounces of Jet Ag per 5 gallons, and 1.6 ounces of Jet Wash per 1 to 5 gallons. When it comes to low pressure, low volume sprayers, 1.6 ounces of jet wash per 5 gallons is recommended. Jet wash is a foaming agent that holds the jet ag on surfaces for an additional 10 to 15 minutes of contact time. It also is a nice pattern indicator, as you can see the white foam. No post-rinse is required. Once it is dry, it is gone forever. Sanitizing is the best way to prevent future pathogen and insect outbreaks. Before
Okay, so Jet Ag is our peroxyacetic acid or paracetic acid material. It's a broad spectrum fungicide, bacteria, and algaecide. It's got a very, very broad label, controls foliar and soil-borne diseases. Obviously, the active ingredient is peroxyacetic acid, PAA. Our mode of action is oxidation. Compatible with many crop production products. At this point, there's no pathogen resistance. It is a physical killer. There's no residue, and the signal word is danger. It is OMRI listed, MRL exempt, 0-day PHI, and a 4-hour REI. The one consideration whenever you are using PAA material, whenever you're using Jet Ag, is do not mix it with any metallic materials. So that means almost all fertilizers, copper, sulfur, magnesium, and zinc. It starts to oxidize them very quickly, and you can see that with a simple jar test. So you can mix it with, we've mixed Jet Ag with Regalia, Stargus, Venerate. It's got a pretty broad compatibility. So it breaks down very quickly. The process is so complete that there's actually, it's exempt from residues and breaks down to oxygen, acetic acid, and water. And like I say, a really broad label. You can read down through this, but we typically are using this as a foliar spray treatment in greenhouses, but often use it as a soil drench as well. It does a really nice job knocking back a broad range of soil microorganisms, and then you can come in with an inoculant and put the organisms that you want in there. And again, a very broad list of diseases that it helps to control. We'll leave that up for just a moment. Oh, no, we'll leave that up for just a moment. And we'll get deeper into this as the presentation goes on. So these are some of the rates that you'll see. Curative at 2 to 4 quarts per acre. Obviously, this is more of an outdoor rate. You'll typically break that down to 2 to 4 quarts per 100 gallons, but we've got small recommendations for doing smaller tanks as well. Soil application is a drench, 1 to 3 gallons per acre. You can use it for water treatment as well. Does a really nice job cleaning out irrigation lines. My colleague John Driver is on this call as well. And often when folks approach me about information for irrigation line cleaning, I call John up and get the skinny on it from him. John, anything you want to add into what we need to know at this point for Jet Ag for irrigation water treatment?
That's a big takeaway I would say is, and I always like compare it because I get the question a lot, the difference between that and standard commercial grade hydrogen peroxide. And the big difference is it is one component, hydrogen peroxide. We also have acetic acid and some stabilizing agents. When we combine those two, there's a third compound created. That's PAA, peroxyacetic acid. That's the whole backbone of the chemistry. So Jet Ag and Jet Oxide. It also gives us 100 times the oxidizing power and stability over the standard commercial grade hydrogen peroxide. So like Steve was saying, what that means is we can actually run that through irrigation lines and have that PA pretty much like from one end to the other. We have that stability. You can't do that with regular commercial grade hydrogen peroxide. It breaks down immediately in air and water. So that's the big difference there.
Thank you, John.
Sure.
So as I mentioned earlier, this all started with me watching Alex inspecting incoming plants. So let's hear what he has to say.
One of the best opportunities that growers have for controlling pests and diseases is inspecting plants thoroughly when they first arrive on site. This is your main opportunity to prevent some pest or disease that you don't already have from establishing itself in your greenhouse. It's often also the time where it's going to be most economical to make any sort of treatment or application to incoming crops, especially if you're dealing with starter plants and small plants. So I have some material here, and I'm going to show you a little bit of how I would inspect plants when they're coming in. The main things that I'm looking for are plant health, diseases, and insects. So the first thing I do is just give a quick visual inspection of the plants that I'm looking at here, and I look for any abnormalities or things that I know are indicators of the presence of disease or pests. So when I'm doing that, I'm kind of looking for the pattern of what the plants look like, and then looking for anything that breaks that pattern that looks unusual or out of ordinary. So if you look at these dwarf Alberta spruces, you see what normal tips look like, and then I have one right here where you can see there's a little bit of growth distortion, twisting growth up at the top here. So that keys me in that something might be going on right there. I take a quicker look. One of the things you always want to have on hand with you is some kind of magnifying lens or loupe. And I take a look at what's going on in here, and I immediately see some shed exoskeletons of aphids. And with a lot of pests like aphids, you'll often see signs of their presence before you actually see the bugs themselves. So you'll see honeydew or excretions of the bugs. You'll see growth distortions from the bugs. You'll see their shed exoskeletons, or you know, things like that, rather than actually seeing the bugs. So now I find this distorted growth. I see those shed exoskeletons. Then I'm going to start looking for live bugs. And you know, I've spent a little time looking through these, and even though there's a few of those shed exoskeletons, I'm not seeing any live aphids on here. Another really good strategy is just taking a clipboard with a white piece of paper on it, and you shake your plants and see what falls out. So I shake these plants really thoroughly, and then I'll use that lens again and try and take a look at what's on here and just see what I've got. And I don't see any live aphids on here, and I'm not seeing any other pests that I would be looking for, like thrips or white flies or anything like that. So I can say from there that plant's probably good to go from a bug standpoint. It looks like they had aphids at one point, but probably got sprayed effectively before they actually came into this greenhouse. Another thing I'm looking for is the presence of diseases. So again, you're going to be looking for anything like bald patches or signs of rot or things like that, if you're looking at foliar diseases. And so a lot of times when you've got really dense, fully grown things coming in, shipping is a time where things can often get infected with botrytis. So if you look at this plant here, it's got a little bit of botrytis on the inside of it, but doesn't seem to be completely disastrous here. And then all the other ones all look really good. So you're just doing a quick walkthrough looking for presence of diseases and pests. Flowering things, again, you're going to be looking again for aphids, thrips, mites, and things like that. So on here I've got a little tiny spider, that's fine. I've got some springtails, that's fine. You expect to see those. I'll often also make a distinction between pests that are kind of omnipresent, ubiquitous, that are basically going to be anywhere that you've got plants, you'll have some of those pests appearing, versus pests that I really want to try and strictly exclude from the greenhouse. So for example, if I were to see one or two thrips on a plant, that wouldn't necessarily make me reject that plant out of hand. However, if I saw mealybugs on a plant, I would definitively be rejecting that plant out of hand. I have not had mealybugs on premise for a long time. They don't travel well on their own, so if I can completely exclude them from the greenhouse, I can make sure that I never really have to deal with them. So Moving on from insect pests, we want to look again at the root zone and try and look at root health, presence of root diseases, and really importantly now, looking for the presence of root pests. In the last couple of years, root aphid and root mealy have become really serious pests. And I know in the cannabis industry, they're really, really worried about those pests. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of good ways to treat them once they do appear. So what you're looking for with root aphids and with root mealy is you'll often see those same kind of shed exoskeletons on plants. The root mealy in particular will often leave some white spots on the insides of the pot that are really diagnostic of their presence as well. So I've already looked through these plants and I'm not seeing any presence of those aphids or root mealy. And I'm also now looking to establish how healthy these roots are. So on these conifers, I've got some really nice light colored roots and not too much dark black roots. And I'm also looking that those roots aren't sloughing off or showing any signs of rot diseases like Pythium or Phytophthora. Here's another example of a more actively growing vegetative plant, and you can see you've got really healthy white root system that's coiling. There's no sections of dead root on there, and that's just a really healthy looking root system that you're not seeing any presence of bugs on, good root hairs, all of that developing there. In the root zone, you can also make a distinction between diseases and pests that are always present and ones that you really want to strictly exclude. So those root aphids and root mealy, you want to really kind of have a zero tolerance for those when they're coming in, unless you can do some kind of really radical treatment on them to make sure that they're not getting in. Similarly, diseases like Pythium are kind of really present anywhere that there's wet soil, but diseases like Phytophthora can be absolutely devastating if they get into your growing system. So it's important to differentiate between those things. Again, this is your best opportunity to do any kind of treatment to your plants if you're going to do that before bringing them into production. So really common are things like root dips or whole plant dips. That's a really good way to get full coverage, especially if you're using biological products. Coverage is really, really important. And if you're doing any type of inoculant drench of a microbial product, doing it when you've got young, small plants is going to be much more cost effective than trying to do it later in the production cycle of things.
Let's recap for a moment before we move on. So what's so important about this inspection cycle when plants are coming in, this is your opportunity to prevent bringing somebody else's problem in. When I had my own garden center greenhouse for years, as the boxes of transplants came in, we opened them up and we inserted a yellow and a blue sticky card on a stick into each one, left them that way for 24 hours and see what came up out of the plants. It's amazing how many pests can often just get moved around this way. It's one of our biggest problems in the industry. Because you have this opportunity when they're just in a small location, you have the opportunity to either accept the plants, treat them, or toss them out. And you can treat such a small area because everything's so close together, really makes nipping a problem in the bud. As Alex mentioned, you're looking for odd growth patterns, shed exoskeletons for insects, certainly obvious infestations, and necrotic or unusual plant tissue. You don't get many opportunities like this to make sure you're not being a problem, not bringing something in. As Alice was mentioning, you take the pots on, you're looking for root mealy bugs and root aphids, along with nice light green roots and healthy growth. Root mealy bugs and root aphids, they are treatable. We are having success and our labels are developing to have either Grandivo or Venerate as a drench. Does a nice job handling them in some of the research trials that we've seen. And there's a big difference between a couple Western flower thrips and mealybugs. As Alex was mentioning, he has no tolerance for mealybugs, but he's used to dealing with Western flower thrips. They are all but ubiquitous in the greenhouse industry, and so managing them is an easy thing. And certainly you want to make sure that the quality of the roots is up to snuff. So let's talk about creating a scouting routine. So, Alex, I wanted to talk to you about your entire scouting program. What kind of a routine do you have? How do you get started in all this?
So I would say that my scouting routine is definitely an unusual one. If you look around the greenhouse here, you'll see that there are no yellow sticky cards in this greenhouse. And I know that for most people using biological control programs, and even with conventional programs, most people are using yellow sticky cards to keep track of what they've got going on in the greenhouse. The reason I don't have any of them is that I have so many predators and parasites flying around at any given point that I find that whenever I'm putting out those sticky cards, I am selectively catching so many of my predators that it's really a major loss and it affects the system negatively. So I'm relying on much more frequently going through the crops and checking on what's going on here. Thankfully, I'm dealing with a pretty small area, but because I'm dealing with so many things, so many different crops in that area, I do have to go through really regularly. What I really try and do is have, for myself and growers, whenever we're going through irrigation, that's also a time where we're looking for any signs or symptoms of diseases or insects, and trying to incorporate it as much as possible into the regular grower routine. I'm also trying to utilize the rest of my staff as well, and I think it's really important to teach them a lot about the good insects as well as the bad.
So since I've been here, I have seen staff taking inventory, watering, moving plants around, pruning, packing. They can be a big assist in how you scout and recognizing pests. How do you train these people to recognize when there's a pest problem, to know when to come and get you, and recognize the beneficials at the same time?
Right, that's a good question. So one of the first things I like to do if I'm having somebody in a scouting position, I really like to tell them at least a short list of things that I would expect to see on that crop. So anybody who's grown a certain crop multiple times can usually have a pretty good prediction of the pests that you're going to expect to see show up on that crop. And you can give somebody a list of what those things are. So for example, if I'm looking at rosemary, the first thing on there is definitely going to be looking for thrips, but then also aphids, and then maybe a couple diseases like powdery mildew that they should be keeping an eye out for as well. And showing them some pictures, and also taking the opportunity whenever I do find something that definitely has one of those diseases or pests, it's a really great opportunity to gather people around and show them, hey, if you see something like this in the future, do let me know. Another thing I also find really important, because we use such a comprehensive and ecosystem-based approach to biocontrol, I always try and make sure that I show people what the good bugs look like, as well as what the pests look like. And when in doubt, the instruction is, show me what you're seeing, and we'll take it from there. So it is pretty often that somebody will bring me something, and it's just some beneficial doing its normal thing.
Your scouting program, is this your scouting program that you developed? Did you get trained at any? I know a lot of universities do a lot of training in scouting. How did you put all this together?
My scouting program is definitely my own, and I'll freely say that it's a lot less quantitative than a lot of the university-based programs are. I know a lot of people are doing their scouting and have very set, rigid thresholds of exactly how many pests per area, per scouting that they're basing spray decisions or application decisions on. My program is definitely a lot more instinctive and based off of what my experiences are here. There's a lot more moving parts in how my biological control program works. So depending on the season, or the time of year, the different mixture of crops we have in the greenhouse at any given time, it can really influence how I'm going to make those spray decisions or insect release decisions and that kind of thing. University programs are definitely effective and have really been proven for a lot of people, but I think most greenhouse contexts are a lot more homogeneous in what they're growing, and things are a lot more predictable and controllable. So those systems are better in those situations.
So the plant choice that you have, we've been here looking at a lot of different plants. You've got herbs, you've got flowering plants, you've got some woodies. Are there any plants that you just won't grow here because of their pest complex?
So most of the crops that we've decided we don't grow anymore are usually for economic reasons. It's because they've become so commodified that it's just really impossible to make any money on them. So we've dropped a lot of things like poinsettias. We don't do mums. We don't do, and we even do very, very few things like petunias or verbenas or calibrachoas. The pest complex is also a part of it for sure.
So verbena. I have often heard growers go, if I got rid of verbenas, I wouldn't have to worry about western flower thrips. Or if I got rid of verbenas and Gerbera daisies, I wouldn't have to worry about western flower thrips. Do things like that have an influence on your plant selection as well?
They definitely do. I'm glad you mentioned Gerbera daisies. That's another prime example of a plant that we don't grow more specifically for pest reasons. I'm not sure how to answer otherwise, but yeah, there definitely over the years have been a lot of plants where we've stopped growing them just because it was a consistent bug problem or that the source material was always coming in with bugs already.
So, quick recap on that. We were talking about sticky cards, and I know a lot of us use sticky cards, but as Alex was saying, he's got a real problem with them because he just finds so many beneficials stuck to the sticky cards. The scouting program, it's just something that has to be done just consistently. Not only the primary IPM person, but everybody there who's grabbing plants, people who are pruning, fertilizing, just everybody there needs to be ready to recognize when a problem's taking off. I've got to watch Peachtree over the 2 days I were there, and you can see everybody is keeping a careful eye on the plants. And then we were talking to that plant choice. Gerbera daisies is one that I often hear is just a terrible problem. And I know an awful lot of small greenhouse growers. They've got up to 5 or 6 Quonset type houses or standalone houses, and many of them often say they always know where to find western flower thrips. The first thing they do is go look at their Gerbera daisies, then they look at their verbenas. If they're clean, they feel really confident that they've got something there, that they're clean. So the disease triangle. So we're getting ready to move into diseases, and everybody should be aware of the disease triangle. And so a couple things. What we're looking at is that when you have the combination of a susceptible host plant, you have a pathogen that can infect that plant, and the environment is right. The humidity, the temperature, the lighting, that's when you get plant disease. If you have an impact on any one of them, you have a pathogen that is too weak to infect, then you're not going to see plant disease. You can adjust the humidity, bring the humidity down, and you often will prevent plant disease. And then, of course, resistant versus susceptible host plants. If you've got a susceptible host plant, the pathogen is present, and the temperature and humidity and lighting are right, you're very likely to get disease. But there are an awful lot of resistant plants around, and we certainly try and grow an awful lot of them to make sure that we're dealing with as little as possible.
Steve, I'd like to just interject one thing.
Please, Matt.
The triangle has become a pyramid because there's one more side, which is time. So most diseases need time to do their thing on the plant. So if you ever see, and that's why plant pathologists, when we do, we're looking at plants that are diseased or problematic, something's going wrong with them, we ask, how long did it take for that plant to come down with these symptoms? Because if they're overnight, a lot of this is not maybe a disease or an insect, it's a spray application, or it's something that you had done or environmental, and it occurred really quickly. So time is one thing that we look for when diagnosing for disease.
And Matt, I think you just named what our next webinar series should be, is we'll call it Plant Detectives. There certainly is a lot of material there, and it's one of the toughest jobs all of us do, is identifying what went wrong. So let's talk about managing basal downy mildew. This is as they noted, this is an important crop at Peachtree Farms, and this has been a disease that came on like gangbusters not that many years ago. So let's get started.
Basal downy mildew is one of the most difficult to manage diseases affecting growers right now. It's only been in the United States for about 10 or 15 years, but now, without fail, every summer and fall, it is really causing serious devastation to basil crops around the country. It's an oomycete disease, so it's caused by what's sometimes called a water mold rather than a true fungal organism. So that's one of the things that makes treating it a little bit more difficult. The organism is more biologically similar to something like late blight than it is to powdery mildew. The really tricky thing about downy mildew and diseases like it is that it's a truly systemic infection. So once a plant is infected, there is no way to cure it. Once you see signs of the disease, it is too late to save that plant. And I think that's an important point to repeat, because when growers are dealing with downy mildew, they're often thinking, surely there's something I can do at this point. And again, once you see signs of the disease already, it is too late. You have missed your window for dealing with it. Those plants are infected. So for managing downy mildew, prevention is essential. That is the only way that you're going to prevent this disease, especially if you're growing organically. So for scouting for downy mildew, the things that you're going to be looking for initially are some very angular yellowing on the tops of the leaf surface like this. And this is very different than yellowing you'll see due to nutrient deficiencies or other diseases, where you can see that the yellowing is very delineated by veins on the leaf. It's very angular. So a leaf might be split right down the middle, yellow on one side, green on the other. And again, once you see this sign, it is too late to prevent infection. So a lot of the plants that I've got here, I found yesterday, and under normal circumstances, I would have destroyed them immediately, but I've kept a couple here just for the purposes of this video. So as the disease progresses, what you'll start to see is some white to gray, all the way to black, fuzzy growth on the bottom side of the leaf. And that's the actual sporulation. That's how the disease spreads through the air and starts to infect other plants. So when you're scouting regularly and finding leaves like this before they've really started to sporulate, that means that you're really doing a lot to prevent the spread of it. However, that's not going to be everything. There are some downy mildew resistant cultivars that are on the market now. Some of them are more resistant than others. I know Rutgers has a really good program going on right now for breeding resistant varieties, and they've had some pretty successful resistant varieties. For our purposes, because we're selling to a grocery store though, a lot of the attributes of those plants don't really meet our purposes. The Rutgers varieties tend to be very tall, they have long internodes, and in doing taste trials on a lot of them, we have found them to be a little lacking in flavor. So the varieties that we use are called Everleaf and Everleaf Emerald Towers. They are really stocky, short internode, sturdy plants. So because we sell to a grocery store, they have to survive the demands of shipment. So if you can imagine, these plants need to be able to go on a truck and shake, 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 shake for a long time, and then still maintain their upright habit without lodging or falling over. And we found these varieties to have some intermediate resistance. They're more resistant than a basic Genovese basil, but they are definitely not fully resistant to downy mildew. So for treatment and prevention of downy mildew, again, it's very much a preventative approach to dealing with the disease. So we're trying to do basically everything we can to gain an edge on it. That starts with cultural controls. So we are maintaining humidity levels very low in the greenhouse. We're doing only ebb and flood irrigation on our basil to make sure that there's never periods of leaf wetness. high humidity and leaf wetness create ideal conditions for infection by downy mildew. In addition to that, we're relying on lighting to help reduce the occurrence of the disease. With lighting, especially night interruption lighting, if you can interrupt periods of darkness that are over 6 or 7 hours, you can actually prevent the sporulation of the disease by interrupting its circadian rhythm. And again, it's not a true fungus, it's a water mold. It's closer to an animal than a fungus, and it has a circadian rhythm just like we do. So by interrupting that cycle, by breaking up the nighttime, you can really reduce the occurrence of the disease and sporulation. We also use a lot of biological spray products. Stargus and Regalia are two that we use regularly on a pretty tight rotation. This time of year, sometimes every 5 to 7 days, we'll be treating with preventative products like Stargus and Regalia. Periodically using bicarbonates, but you can't use those too often because basil has very fragile leaves, and if you're using products like that too often, you can definitely cause some phytotoxicity and leaf damage. We try to use copper as little as possible because there's definite human health risks with overuse of copper, and of course you don't want blue residue on basil that's going to be in a grocery store.
So a couple quick takeaways from what Alex was just saying. Obviously, basil downy mildew, incredibly challenging. It is an oomycete. It's not a true fungus, and that's part of the reason that he was talking about night interruption lighting. Doesn't really do a whole lot unless really intense on too many diseases, but it works well here. This is all about prevention. So he was talking about the plants that I had asked him to hold because they were good examples. As soon as we were done interviewing, they immediately were composted, meaning they went in the trash. They headed out. Downy mildew is a systemic infection. While there are resistant cultivars out there, make sure that you're finding those that actually meet your marketing needs. There's just something about a Genovese basil when you're cooking with it. And those that Alex is using, that Peachtree is using, they definitely, those varieties have got a very strong Genovese-like flavor. So when we're talking about varieties, there's susceptible varieties. And obviously, before basil downy mildew came along, most for culinary uses, an awful lot of the basil being grown was straight Genovese basil, highly susceptible. And so you would need to be applying biofungicides to that on a regular basis to even have a chance of growing. And we've seen where that just has not worked well. There are varieties that are tolerant. They will put up with some degree of pressure. And so we have a lot of strains of downy mildew as well. So there's a combination there where you start to separate out varieties that are actually economically viable to grow, and then those that are resistant. And resistant is really important. Resistance does not mean that you don't have to do these other practices, the cultural controls and the use of Stargus and Regalia. It's an extra tool in that. The last thing you want to do is to boldly go, I'm growing resistant varieties and I don't need to worry about managing downy mildew anymore. Over time, what you'll find is that resistance, we've seen it happen in many plants, the resistance starts to slip and now you're back where you started from. And this can happen really quickly. So Alex had talked about a couple cultural controls, bottom watering. The idea here is to keep the leaves nice and dry. So at Peachtree, they use ebb and flood. Reducing the humidity has a huge impact on downy mildew. And this night interruption lighting, this is very specific to these water molds, but by turning the lights on for a short period in the middle of the night, they can't complete their life cycle. Alex had mentioned using Stargus and Regalia in prevention. We know that Regalia is going to be an SAR, ISR material, so it turns on the plant's defense system. Stargus does some of that, but it also deposits these lipoproteins, lipopeptides on the surface, and it does a really nice job in prevention. Alex had mentioned the use of potassium bicarbonate products. They raise the pH on the leaf surface. I have used them often. He had made this note, and I want to really drive this home. Potassium bicarbonate products can be very phytotoxic. My general take on them is you can apply them once every 3 or 4 weeks. Typically, the first time you apply within the label rate, unless you have really sensitive plants, you're not going to see much damage. But if you come back too soon, it damages the cuticle on the leaf. You can just drop all the leaves on immediately. And well, with basil, that's not going to give you too much of a saleable product. So let's talk about Regalia. So what is Regalia? Regalia is a plant extract of Renautria saccharinensis. I ought to be able to say that enough. I've only been using the product for 10 years. It's a really broad spectral fungal and bacterial management tool. What I like about Regalia is the modes of action, which we'll be getting into. It's really interesting. It does not act directly on the fungal organism, but it turns on the plant's own defenses. Typical rate is 1 to 4 quarts per acres, and if you go with the CG formula on the label, you'll see that it has per gallon directions as well. Multiple modes of action. We'll get into those in a moment. I have mixed Regalia with many materials, certainly including coppers. So within Marrone, we refer to it as BioUnite. When you mix a biological material like with Regalia with something from the synthetic or conventional world, Regalia happens to be remarkably good at tank mixing. And here's where I cover myself. Always make sure if you're doing a tank mix that you're not familiar with, do the jar test first. Mix a proportionate amount of it up into a jar. Make sure it's compatible. You don't see any precipitates, any heating, any bubbling, and then apply it to a small amount of the crop. Come back 48 hours later. If it looks like nothing's burnt, everything is okay, you know that you've got a tank mix you can go ahead and use. Many different ways to apply it. Foliarly, airily, you can use it as a drench as well. Let's move on. So these are the modes of action in Regalia. It inhibits pathogen growth. And so when Regalia activates these biochemical pathways inside the plant, you get phenolics, phytoalexins, and pathogenesis-resistant proteins. They essentially turn on the plant's own defense system, and they do it before the plant gets disease. And this is one of the major tools in being proactive about managing diseases. Regalia does a fabulous job of turning on these pathways. It just simply makes the plant a lot tougher and prevents disease in that way. It also strengthens the cell walls. This is through the deposition of lignin. So again, part of this biochemical pathway is the plant starts to deposit more lignins in the cell walls. As cell walls get thicker and stronger, makes it a lot more difficult for the spore to actually be able to form that penetration peg and be able to get in. So you get a much tougher plant. And then finally, Regalia acts as a biostimulant. It enhances plant health. With fruiting plants like tomatoes and peppers, we'll often actually see a boost in yield, but we'll also see it puts out chlorophyll B, so the plants will be greener, and you'll often see a real growth benefit by applying Regalia. So Regalia is MRL exempt, so it's exempt from residue levels. 4-hour REI, 0 PHI. It's a frac code of P5. We've already talked about the rates, 1 to 4 quarts per acre, 7-day interval, and it is Renautria saccharinensis, and it is OMRI listed. So Stargus, so Alex had mentioned Stargus. Stargus is, again, one of our newer materials. Typical rate is 1 to 4 quarts per acre. It is also best used preventatively. That's a characteristic of most of these biopesticides. You can apply it for both foliar and soil-borne diseases. And I know it's not in this presentation, but we've seen good results using Stargus to manage Phytophthora and Rhizoctonia in several different ornamentals. It is the active ingredient. It's a Bacillus amyloliquefaciens. A strain is F727. Shortly on a new label, it'll be labeled Bacillus nakamori F727. And this is where it really differentiates from a lot of the other Bacillus products out there. very novel peptides are produced. And so it does a lot more than just managing powdery mildew. It can go after downy mildews, white mold, Cercospora. And so the modes of action are from the lipopeptides. It does, like Regalia, it does turn on some of the ISR, SAR systems, and the FRAC code here is BM02. So Stargus currently has a 2-year shelf life, and it is both, when you buy a jug of Stargus, it's got the lipoproteins and peptides in there, but it's also a living component. And so what you see where the circling here is you'll actually get colonization from this product. Regalia is just a weed extract, so there's nothing living there, but Stargus is a living bacillus, and this colonization helps to prevent infection simply by being there on plant surfaces. So this is more on the modes of action, which personally I find all of this fascinating. I've watched people roll their eyes, but to me, knowing the mode of action helps me figure out what products to use. So we've got these peptides that are produced during the fermentation process. They actually attack spore germination, and this goes after the germ tube. And it's like a contact kill. You get this colonization on the leaves that I mentioned. So by having all of them there, by having so much of the Bacillus nakamori growing there, it prevents access to other pathogen. And then again, it turns on, almost all the Bacillus products turn on this ISR system to some extent. So here's the art of use. You can see the rates as we go across here. You can, oh, go ahead. Let's keep on moving. The broad spectrum, downy mildew, Botrytis, fusarium, and so much more. These multiple modes of action that we mentioned, backpack, however you want to apply it, and the active ingredient. And so now we're going to talk about powdery mildews with Alex.
Powdery mildew is another one of those ubiquitous, ever-present diseases that growers of all types have to worry about. Basically, for any crop, any plant, there is a powdery mildew that affects it. Important thing to know about powdery mildew is it would be more accurate to say powdery mildews, plural, because there are multiple different organisms that cause powdery mildew on different groups of plants. So right here I've got rosemary, and behind me I've got dill. And both of these plants are susceptible to powdery mildew, but it's not the same powdery mildew. So it's important to do a little bit of homework for whatever crop you're growing and know which species of powdery mildew affects it. So for example, I know that if I see powdery mildew on this rosemary, I don't have to worry about that powdery mildew jumping onto the dill or vice versa. Powdery mildews are true fungi. They infect the leaf surface area of various plants and just cause those powdery lesion growths that can make plants really unsightly. They are rarely fatal to plants, but they can cause ornamental plants to become unsellable or seriously reduce yields in other crops. Scouting for powdery mildew is a pretty simple matter. You're just looking for starting to see those powdery patches on the surface of leaves, usually on the upper surface of leaves. And one of the things that I'm always looking for is when conditions are favorable for powdery mildew. So specifically, like when you've got weather like summer thunderstorm weather, where you've got really hot, humid days with thunderstorms that roll through in the afternoon, those kind of conditions are usually really, really favorable for powdery mildew to develop on a lot of different crops. Anytime you've got really stagnant, slow-moving air, still air, and lack of airflow is something that can also create really favorable conditions for powdery mildew as well. Controlling powdery mildew is best done with a preventative approach. Once you have symptoms on leaves, it can be treated, but it will often leave some kind of permanent damage. So especially for ornamental crops, you really want to try and stay ahead of it and be treating for powdery mildew before it even shows up. We use a lot of cultural controls for powdery mildew, so trying to keep humidity low and trying to maintain really good airflow and light penetration into plant canopies will really reduce severity of symptoms and occurrence. We also regularly use some different spray products. Bicarbonates like Millstop are really effective for controlling powdery mildew, but they can cause some phytotoxicity if you're using them too frequently. We also use a lot of bacillus-based products like cease and Stargus for control, as well as Regalia, which can really help to boost the plant's natural defenses and strengthen that plant cuticle against powdery mildew and other fungal diseases. It's really important, again, to stay ahead of the disease, which means that you want to stay on a pretty tight rotation and spray frequency, especially when conditions are favorable. There's not, especially for these cultivated herbs, they're culinary herbs, there's not a lot of really resistant varieties available for powdery mildew resistance. We have found some plants that are a little better than others. So for example, we grow Beargarten sage instead of Grower's Friend or some other varieties of sage because we've found over years of growing them that they have at least some intermediate resistance to powdery mildew or will show symptoms less severely than other varieties will. And even though they might be a little bit slower growing, we find that those slightly resistant varieties can be a little bit better. For a lot of other plants that are more intensively bred like squash, there are definitely more and less powdery mildew resistant varieties that are available. Anyone who's ever taken a plant pathology course will of course remember the disease triangle. So plant diseases occur when you have a susceptible host, a virulent pest, and favorable conditions. So if you've got a variety that's resistant, that really helps on one side of that triangle, but you still need to make sure that you're addressing the other sides. Just because you have a variety that's more resistant doesn't mean that you no longer have to spray ever. You're still going to be needing to use those sprays. You're still going to need to be using cultural controls and maintaining conditions that are not so susceptible to disease development if you want really effective disease control. This applies not just to powdery mildew, but downy mildew, botrytis, and basically any other plant disease that you can think of. You really want to make sure that you're addressing every single one, all three of the legs of that disease triangle to really be effective at preventing disease.
So a quick recap, and we are running, we're getting tight on time. So obviously powdery mildew can affect all crops. As Alex said, we should be calling them powdery mildews. There are many. And so you need to know which powdery mildews affects which crops so that you can intermingle crops. One of the easiest things to scout for, and yet one of the easiest things to miss. It comes on so fast sometimes. It's amazing how quickly you can get that infection. The ideal conditions are those afternoon summer thunderstorms. You have just the right amount of heat and humidity. Anything you can do to improve your airflow is going to help. And Regalia, followed by Stargus and Jet Ag, along with the potassium bicarbonates, are fundamental parts of managing that program. This is one of those places that Regalia has really gotten a great reputation for, is helping to manage greenhouse powdery mildew problems. And here you can see untreated powdery mildew on the left and treated with Regalia CG on the right. So we're going to be talking about managing botrytis with Alex now.
So over the past couple years, we've been doing this really cool new program called Winter Sizzle. It's kind of an alternative to traditional fall and winter crops like mums and poinsettias, which are both really commodified and hard to make money on, and also really don't handle cold weather very well. So this program is a lot of ornamental evergreens and really hardy plants like dwarf conifers and things like that. And they're things that you can actually leave outside all the way down to temperatures in even the single digits for a lot of the stuff. So it's a really cool program that lasts a lot longer into the winter. This here is Kaluna. It's a type of heather, and it's a really cool flowering crop. So when you've got flowering crops like this, of course, one of the things that you start to get concerned about is botrytis. Botrytis is another fungal disease that is really almost universal in its host complex. Pretty much any plant under the right conditions can get infected by botrytis. Botrytis usually starts on dead plant material like dead flowers, and then from there can spread into the plant and actually start killing plants. So cultural controls are really, really essential for controlling botrytis as well as a lot of other diseases. But with botrytis, if you can manage your humidity levels and keep humidity below about 80%, you can almost completely eliminate your occurrence of botrytis. But in the fall, this time of year where you've got less and less light, you've got wet conditions and high humidity, you can definitely start to see botrytis occurring. And it's also very prevalent in early spring as well. I look for botrytis a lot wherever I've got spots, for example, where the roof is leaking, or if there's anything that might be causing drips on certain areas of benches. That's where you're going to see botrytis starting up. Botrytis can cause cankers as well. So certain types of plants will get botrytis infecting right at the crown of the plant, and it can really quickly kill the entire plant and spread really quickly from there. Our facility is really well set up to prevent botrytis with cultural controls. So again, we've got open roofs. We're doing primarily bottom irrigation. There's very little leaf wetness. We're heating from underneath as well, so that helps to really drive down humidity levels, and really just doing everything we can to eliminate as much leaf wetness and humidity as possible. And that goes a really long way in preventing botrytis for us. Occasionally, with really wet weather conditions, we do have botrytis popping up on certain things, and there's various products that are really helpful for control. Peroxyacetic acid can be really effective at control, but you have to make sure you're using it at rates that aren't going to cause damage to the plants themselves. Bicarbonate products, again, can be helpful. And then a lot of bacillus type products and regalia as well can really help to boost the plant's natural immunity to botrytis. I'm not aware of very much by way of truly resistant cultivars of plants to botrytis, but there are definitely types of plants that are more and less susceptible to botrytis. If you've got anything that's got really juicy vegetative growth, like a lot of flowering annuals, those things are going to be things that you really have to worry about botrytis on. So whether it's pansies, nemesia, snapdragons, all of those things, and of course geraniums, where you've got large flowers that are frequently dying back and becoming infected. Those are areas where you really have to worry about botrytis popping up. So scouting botrytis, you're going to want to look for especially well-established crops where you're getting canopies that are connecting, and that really reduces airflow. And again, once you've got that connected canopy and reduced airflow, that's going to be really prime time for botrytis to start popping up. And anything where you've got continually flowering crops, so again, I mentioned geraniums, but these kalunas might start to become an issue. Once a crop has sat around for a little while and you've got dead flowers that need to be removed, if you're not really proactive about removing those dead flowers and other dead tissue from the plants, those are frequently sites of infection for botrytis.
As you can see, summarizing the points, high humidity is a big challenge. So you improve airflow, want to get rid of all the spent flowers and any necrotic tissue. I know in tomatoes, you always see it wherever the pruning points are. Look for places where the greenhouse drips. Generally, most of our older greenhouses are going to have some place that they drip, and that's a great place for the infection to take off. There's no real plant resistance, but the combination of Stargus, Regalia, and Jet Ag 5 can go a long way to help you managing botrytis, and of course, bottom heat and watering. Go ahead, Angela, push the button.
As a lavender grower, one of the things I worry about most is soil-borne diseases. So that's Pythium, Phytophthora, Rhizoctonia, and a few others as well. But Pythium is one that I deal with pretty regularly, especially during hot weather. So a lot of these diseases will affect the root zone, and one of the things that you'll see that will tip you off to the beginnings of infection is plants that are adequately watered that are wilting, which indicates that their vascular system and root system is no longer able to adequately provide moisture to the plant anymore. Once you start to see plants wilting while they're adequately watered, you'll start taking a look at the root zones and seeing that roots are starting to be brown and having things like where the cortex will slough off the root when you touch it. And with some diseases, you'll even see or even experience really bad smell associated with some of these root-borne diseases. So a healthy lavender plant like this one, you'll see has some good light-colored roots that are going around. And once you start to have root-borne diseases, these roots will be dark brown all the way to black. So I have an example here of a plant that's infected with probably Pythium that I've kept around just to show this. It's something that I would normally be roguing out of the crop immediately. And if we pull the roots out of here, you'll see that these roots are very, very dark in color, and they break apart when you touch them. And they just the roots will just kind of fall apart and slough off when you touch them. That's some indications of Pythium being present. Sanitation and prevention are really key to preventing a lot of these root-borne diseases, but you can also do really well with inoculating the root zone with beneficial microbes that will outcompete some of these disease-causing organisms. Watering is also really key. Most of these disease-causing soil-borne organisms are anaerobic. They need oxygen-free environments to really proliferate, which they find when plants are overwatered or waterlogged. So this can be a real issue outdoors in periods of heavy rain, but also in facilities where improper amount of attention is being paid to water. Making good irrigation decisions and training people how to irrigate is something that probably doesn't get enough attention paid to it in a lot of places. I know in a lot of greenhouses and facilities, it's kind of the low man on the totem pole who gets stuck with doing a lot of the irrigation, and the tendency then is to overwater, because what people don't want to see is plants that have dried out and died. However, just keeping every plant wet all the time is definitely not a good way to do things. As we talked about with root-borne or soil-borne diseases, a lot of those diseases proliferate when you have wet conditions. One of the keys that I try and teach people about irrigation is you really have to think about the reserve capacity of the container you're growing in. So when something is in a much smaller container, like a plug, it really does not have much of a buffer between being adequately watered and being so dry that it dies. If something is in a much larger pot, there's definitely going to be much more of a reserve capacity there. Additionally, I like to make differentiation between plants that want to dry out between waterings and plants that really want to stay evenly moist. A lot of ornamental plants really want to stay evenly moist throughout their growing cycle, but plants like lavender and rosemary really do benefit from drying down significantly in between waterings. Now, it's important to also note, you also don't want to let plants get too dry between waterings. One of the things that we've found can happen, especially with lavender, is that if they get too dry between waterings, the shock of suddenly being watered can cause some root damage that can then be an entryway for soil-borne illnesses.
And a quick recap on that. So we're looking for plants that appear wilted, even when watered well, certainly brown or discolored roots. that cortex slipping off. That's a characteristic. That's a definitely something I've used often in looking at plants. Bad odors from when it gets anaerobic, you can definitely smell what happens. And I strongly recommend the use of beneficial microbes or soil inoculants. They go a long way to preventing an awful lot of disease. And the big one that everybody fights with all the time is good watering. It's probably one of the toughest things that you can train somebody to do, is how to water well indoors. It's very, very challenging to do. Don't ever underestimate how long it takes to train somebody to be a good waterer. So our BioUnite approach. So what we're looking for are IPM programs that harness the power of biology along with chemistry. Here's how you get hold of us. Now you can skip it. Here's how you get hold of us. Here's our sales team, and you can see where they're all plotted out. You can also find this at the Marrone Bio website. Here's our technical support. I'm the only one who wears both hats because I have the Northeast, but we have technical support for the entire country. Again, you can find this at our website. And here are all our trademark stations. So Angela, it's yours now. You're going to give away some stuff, right?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Steve. And I would love to hear on the chat, you know, how did you think we're doing a little bit different format with this webinar? So the videos are something new we're trying this time, and I'd love to get your feedback. Were the videos helpful? Do you prefer the video versus just going through slides and going through data? Let us know, because we want to put some interesting content together that hopefully is engaging and informative and doesn't feel like the same old webinar presentation. So let us know. While we're getting ready to switch speakers and go into our safety talks, we want to say thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join us for this webinar. And as Alex said very early in the presentation on one of his videos, you know, you never want to be far from a magnifying glass or a loupe. And so we would like to give away one of these. It's an Olo clip. It's something that you can attach to your phone, and it's a universal clip. So no matter what type of smartphone you have, this one should work. And what it does is it fits right over your camera, and it magnifies what you're looking at. So you can just look at items through your screen, or if you'd like, you can obviously take a picture of the magnified object. So a really savvy gift item that we would like to give one lucky winner. If you don't win, hang on. We're going to give another one away at the end of the presentation. So we've got a really hard question for you to answer. And how we do this is I'm going to ask the question, and then what I need you to do is give your answer in the chat. And you want to reply to all. So not just the panelists, but all the attendees. We want to try to make this as transparent as possible. And I need the complete answer, okay? So our question is, I'm going to ask it in 3 seconds, okay? So get ready. If you're busy multitasking, you're going to want to be ready to chime in on the chat in 3, 2, and 1. So our very first video that went through the important steps to help prevent disease, what was that first important step? So that's part 1 of the question. What was that first important step, and what Marrone Bio product is best used for that important first step? Okay, so what is the first step you want to take to help prevent disease, and what Marrone Bio product is best used for that step? So go ahead and answer that in the chat. Awesome, we're getting some responses. So the first important step is to sanitize, and the product is Jet Ag. So my colleague Nick will go ahead and identify, and Nick may be getting ready to, so Nick, if you can't do it, I will do it, but we'll identify who that winner is in just a second, okay? All right, and remember, if you have any questions, we're gonna go ahead and wait until the end to do question and answer. But if you have any questions, please use the feature on the bottom of your screen, the Q&A feature. Go ahead and post your question in there, and we'll try to answer as we go, and then we'll also review the questions at the end. But you should be able to see the question and answer little feature at the bottom. Okay, with that, let's keep rocking and rolling. Now I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Nick. He is a cannabis grower, and has some experience in educating employees on the importance of safety. So he's going to go through the worker and handler pesticide safety and training overview. So Nick, take it away.
Well, thank you, Angela. Thank you everyone for an awesome presentation so far. Hopefully I can keep the bar that high. It's going to be a pretty hard one there. So this presentation is really designed to familiarize viewers with the worker protection standard. I'm going to say this right now. I'm going to say this many times throughout. The worker protection standard requires that you train your employees on pesticide safety training and being around pesticides. We'll cover these sort of topics in this webinar, but we do not satisfy the requirement to train your employees. That's your responsibility. You still have to do this. I'm sure everyone knows this. Just want to get that out there, make sure we're all on the same page. This webinar has been put together from various sources, universities, government entities, a little bit here and there, pulled together and tried to make a really comprehensive presentation. It was originally designed for a cannabis audience. I adapted it to the greenhouse. I'm sure you guys will bear with me. So the purpose of this information is to really provide an understanding and awareness to workers, to employees and employers of what their rights are, what their responsibilities are, and just general safety topics for pesticides. At the end of the day, we want everyone to be safe. So that's kind of where we're going with this presentation. You can move on to the next slide. So under the Worker Protection Standard, which is part of FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Rodenticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act, defines workers as basically anyone who's working on a farm producing agricultural commodity. So in a greenhouse, this could be the people that do the irrigation, the people that prune plants, the people that package plants. However, a worker is not trained to handle pesticides. If you've been trained to handle pesticides, you are a pesticide handler, which is the next slide here. So a handler is anyone who is going to do any mixing, loading, application, transfer, anything that has to do with pesticides. You probably are a handler. Anyone who disposes of pesticides or fixes application equipment while it has pesticide in it is also a handler. When you have to be 18 years old if you're a handler as well. An interesting thing that most people don't realize is Clonex dip or any type of rooting hormone is actually a pesticide. So that's one place where people are handling pesticides and don't really think about it very often. So what are pesticides? A pesticide is designated by the EPA as a pesticide, essentially. So they're all registered with the EPA. There are category 25B products, which are pesticides, but not registered with an EPA number. Those are oils and things like that. So let's go back for 1 second. Sulfur burning. Sulfur burning is a practice that's pretty common within at least the cannabis greenhouse industry. I don't think the traditional industry uses this nearly as much, but it is illegal and unsafe. Basically, it's used to control powdery mildew, or that's the thought process behind it. However, it's not registered for that, and it would be in violation of the label. The label is always the law, and it is federal law, so you should follow it. What forms of pesticides can be encountered during your activity? Well, you have liquids, Regalia, Regalia, Venerate, things like that, Jet Ag. It should drop down more things. There we go. You have dust, dustable sulfur, you have granules, you have gases, you have residues on plants, and you have gels like cloning gels. Really residues on plants and on tables, on benches is probably where you're going to get the most exposure in a greenhouse because you're rubbing up against it, getting that on your clothes, your hair, your hands, whatnot. You always got to wear your proper PPE, but we'll talk more about that moving forward. So your potential sources of pesticide exposure: treated plants and soil, of course, tractors, sprayers, other application equipment. If your head house is multi-use, make sure that your application equipment, your pesticides are all stored separately and locked, because that's a very big potential exposure point. Irrigation equipment is in my opinion, you should always assume the irrigation water has pesticides in it. You'll be safer assuming that than the other way around. And work clothes, so your shoes, your PPE, anything like that can have pesticide residue on them. And that's a really big way to bring it home and contaminate people that aren't usually in the operation. In greenhouses, oftentimes you have an entryway sanitation mat, which has some sort of sanitizer in it. It's a really great practice to help limit the spread of disease. However, that is another potential exposure. So as you're applying pesticides, you do have drift occurring occasionally, and it can happen in a field, it can happen in a greenhouse. In a greenhouse, you have to be really cognizant of your air intake and exhausts. Marking off the exhaust fans while an application is going on is a really good practice. Well, turning them off if possible, but sometimes in Southern California, we have 100-degree days out here, and it's really hard to turn your exhaust fans off in a greenhouse if it's 100 degrees. Your plants won't be very happy with you if you do. Neither will your workers. So those are all just things to think about. Pesticides can also be in irrigation water, chemigation, which is the use of irrigation water to apply pesticides to soils and crops, basically through a drip system or an overhead sprinkler system, something like that, or ebb and flow, I guess you could apply it as well. Pesticides are going to enter the body through oral inhalation, your eyes and your skin, the dermal routes. Skin exposures when you get direct contact with pesticide or pesticide residues. You can get rashes, blisters, things like that. Eye exposure is a really serious concern when you have something like Jet Ag, which is our peracetic acid product. If you get that in your eyes, it's very caustic. So you really want to avoid exposure. Always wear your proper personal protective equipment and use a closed mixing system whenever possible. Don't touch your eyes. Respiratory exposure in a greenhouse, this is a concern, especially if you have your exhaust fans turned off, you're circulating the same air around. If you're spraying a fine mist, you will be creating an aerosol. So definitely don't enter treated areas without proper PPE, and always just think, let's wear the maximum PPE to make us really safe here and go home at the end of the day. Oral exposure, if you're spraying or working with treated plants and then going to eat your lunch, smoke your cigarette, have some water, chewing gum, it's really high likelihood that you can be exposing yourself. So whenever you're leaving the greenhouse, you should always wash your hands with potable water somewhere and soap, and do that for 30 seconds. We'll talk more about that moving forward. Don't drink your irrigation water, and never drink from pesticide containers. All right, so here we're going over some potential pesticide hazards. Acute effects happen quickly after exposure. Headache, nausea, throwing up, seizures, something like that would be an acute effect. A delayed effect would take a longer time. So if you're getting exposed to small amounts of something every day, that can build up to become a delayed effect. Chronic effects are the results of long exposure, repeated exposure over time, and that's something that cancer, things like that, long-term effects. Sensitization is something that is one of the main primary concerns when you're dealing with microbial-based pesticides. So those are the microbial proteins. If you're exposed to them frequently as like an applicator or a worker, some people can develop sensitization to that, where they have an actual allergic reaction, similar to someone being stung by a bee. That is a very serious event if it does happen, and they need treatment. This just kind of goes over different ways you can have acute pesticide injuries. You can have your headaches, eye irritation, nose pain, throat pain, difficulty breathing, nausea, chest pain, skin irritation, and skin rashes. So there's a wide range of effects. And let's move forward here. So if you have a severe acute poisoning, then you start seeing things like a chest pain, constriction of your pupils, salivation, loss of consciousness, so, or lack of muscle control. Those are serious things, and you would need to, of course, call 911, get someone to a medical treatment as soon as possible. All right, so really it comes down to reducing risk. How can we reduce risk? During the pesticide application, you really need to think about what's going on around you. You need to make sure that there's no workers around, that there's no one being exposed. And there should be bullets that pop in here, I think, if we hit it one more time. Yeah, there we go. So only handlers can enter and work during a pesticide application. So that means all workers must stay out of the field, out of the exclusion zone during the restricted entry intervals. So then you have handlers and early entry workers. An early entry worker is someone that has received specific training and proper personal protection equipment that can then go in and enter a facility. Well, we'll be covered that on the next slide. The restricted entry interval is how long you cannot enter a field after you have applied. Basically, there's PPE and label requirements to have someone entering restricted entry interval treated field. Let's move forward here. The next couple of slides talk about postings and safety. We're all pretty familiar with that, but what I really want to touch on is, let's move forward to the central location here. So your postings have to be in a central location. So you have to keep records of everything you apply. They have to be easily accessible to your employees or a representative that your employee designates. Typically, you want to keep your spray records, your safety data sheets, all in some central location that's easily accessible. This is for compliance reasons. It makes your employees happy when they know what's going on in your operation. It's really about building the whole team up and having everyone involved so they know what's going on. And that way if people know they can check this list, they clock in, they look at this list, make sure there's no REIs they have to avoid for that day. It's just a really good practice to have. And if everyone's looking at this frequently, mistakes are less likely to happen because someone will catch it sooner. So the DPR, you can find these on the DPR. It's our pesticide safety information series. It's 10 publications talking about pesticide safety. You have to post a few of them in your operation. I think it's A7, A8, maybe A9. I think it's A7, A8. But really all these flyers are really good. It just talks about emergency medical care. A lot of growers, especially cannabis growers, will post these postings but not fill them out. It's really important to actually fill out the information on here. If there is an emergency, this is where someone will be taken, and it just gets in there quickly. Very important. Safety data sheets used to be called material safety data sheets. They communicate hazards and outline first aid measures and first response measures if there's a fire or something like that. Talks about what to do in case of a spill. We all know that. I'll just go over the importance of keeping them updated and easily accessible and making sure that people know they're easily accessible and that they're there. So in most situations, you need to post warning signs, especially in confined spaces like a greenhouse, danger, keep out. It has to be in 2 languages, has to have very visible writing on it. It's pictograms, I guess you would call that. And you have to be able to read them from at least 25 feet away. So reducing hazards and pesticide drift. Of course, if you're working somewhere and you notice a pesticide, smell something funny, see a crop duster flying next to you, get out of there, protect yourself. That's your first priority. Picking whatever you're picking or whatever you're doing can probably wait. Leaving immediately is really the first, and be cognizant of your surroundings. If there's a REI sign up on a greenhouse and the fans are on, well, maybe it's not the best idea to stand in front of those fans, or maybe you should ask someone if those need to be posted or marked off. Work clothing, always wear proper work clothing. So closed-toed shoes and socks, long sleeves and long pants. Don't wear sandals. They might be really comfortable in the greenhouse, but at the end of the day, you'll regret that. This slide is really talking about washing your hands. So here's a really interesting picture showing the difference of the different levels of washing your hands, essentially. Anytime you're working in a treated area or working with pesticides or applicating, you should always wash your hands, of course, before you go do anything else. And if you see the different pictures here, one's before washing, you have a rinse and shake, 6 seconds no soap, 6 seconds with soap, 15 seconds with soap, and 30 seconds with soap. And look, you can really see the different levels of fluorescent dye left on their hands after the different amounts of washing, and how that really, if you're contaminated, really washing for a long time and scrubbing well using soap and water is very important. At the application site or wherever you're loading and mixing, you always have to keep decontamination supplies available. So that's water. There's a certain amount based on different regulations that you have to have there. You have to have your soap there, some towels there, some new PPE, depending on what it is. When a worker comes home, they should really be, well, ideally, you should be discarding your work clothes to be washed and laundered and showering before you leave work. If you have a nice facility, that's possible. Not always possible. Sometimes, you have to wear your work clothes home. It's just important if you've been around pesticides or pesticide treated areas that you wash your clothes before you come into contact with your family, bag them up separately, wash them separately. Just take as many precautions as you can to limit the exposures. All right, this is one right here. I had a professor in college that used to be an ag inspector, and he told us stories of people getting really, really sick storing pesticides in squeezed Gatorade bottles, and then their friend finding it in their trunk and drinking it. So shout out to Ben for telling me that story. I still remember it, and it's been on the top of my head throughout my career. And so I just really want to talk about that and say, don't take pesticides home from work, and don't put them in containers used for food. Those are two very big no-nos. It's very illegal, very unsafe. You would definitely have an unhappy regulatory agency if they saw you doing that. So just don't do that. It's better for everyone involved. How and when to get emergency medical care. So if necessary, I'll start with call 911 if you think you've been poisoned or poisoned. Ideally, someone from your work is already there next to you. You can say, hey, Joe, take me to the hospital. I think I just got whatever in my eye, or I just ate some Roundup, something like that. Hopefully that never happens to you, but just know that before handling pesticides, you should have been trained on how to get this care. And so you should already know where to go. Emergency first aid. So let's say you're mixing some jet ag and it spills on you, or your spray line breaks and sprays you. Oh no, I got it on my skin. What am I going to do? Typically, the first thing you do is wash with soap and water, rinse off the material, and then wash with soap and water for 15 minutes. That's for dermal exposures. Eye exposures, you're typically rinsing with water for 15 minutes and then seeking medical attention. Same with an oral exposure. You would really check the label and the safety data sheets. They should have information on how to deal with each type of incident you would be exposed to, and just decontaminate. That's the first step, is cleaning yourself. So employees have a lot of rights when working around pesticides. If they think something is unsafe or illegal or just not a good idea, they should really bring it up with management, say, hey, this is what's going on here. Just asking that question can do a lot sometimes. You do have the right to contact your local agricultural department, and your employer cannot punish you in any way for attempting to comply with this. So you are in the legal right to say, hey, I don't want to do that. You're not supplying me the proper PPE, or I wasn't trained on this, or hey, we're using this on something that's not on the label. Just be aware of these things and know that you have rights, and the worker protection standard is behind you if you're acting in good faith, trying to do something for safety regarding pesticides. All right, this is kind of using pesticides safely. We're just going to go over mixing and loading. Of course, always wear your label, always read your label, instructions, directions, wear your personal protective equipment. Always measure your pesticides carefully and accurately, making sure you're using the right unit of measurement. Prevent pesticides from entering the water sources. So that goes with your rinsing, that goes with your storing your pesticides, that goes with applying them. Just always be cognizant. You don't want to contaminate things, and never mix, load, or clean your equipment near water sources. Good practice in a greenhouse, if you can, is to save the rinsate and spray it the next time, or spray it out over the crop. When you're applying pesticides, you always want to follow your label application instructions, check your application equipment, make repairs, clean equipment. Always transport. Here, let's go to the next slide. We're going to skip through these next ones. I really want to get to the disposing of pesticide containers. Transporting, always just be smart when you're transporting things. Don't throw them on top of your truck and let them fall off the back of the down the road. That's a bad idea. Spill cleanup, you should always have a spill kit. Let's go to the next one. Storing, you always have to have your storage area posted. It needs to be locked. When you go to the next one. Always triple rinse your pesticide containers. That's adding water, swishing around, pouring it out into your tank, doing that 3 times. Always dispose of that rinsate properly. There are some things like this nozzle here in the center where you can puncture your container and rinse it all at once. Just make sure if you're going to use something like that, that meets the requirements in your specific jurisdiction. Protecting sensitive areas from drift, runoff, non-target organisms. Don't apply to pollinators, things like that. Certain things are more friendly than others to pollinators. For example, Grandivo doesn't really have much of effect, whereas something like Jet Ag would have more an effect. We have application exclusion zones. Basically, don't enter a greenhouse if someone's spraying inside of it. And if someone does enter it, you need to stop spraying and make sure the application area is clear before you resume application. Let's go to the understanding the parts of the label. Here we go. All right, this is really important stuff right here. You gotta know how to read a label. And yes, it's English, and yes, you should be able to read it. However, I gotta change my headphone out here. It's dying on me. So there's different parts of the label that you need to be familiar with. So when looking at the label here, we have the brand name, we have the active ingredients, we have the EPA registration number. All pesticides should have an EPA registration number if you're using them, except for 25B products. So every pesticide has a signal word on it. The signal word tells you basically how toxic it is to humans. So caution would be slightly toxic, warning is moderately toxic, danger is highly toxic, and danger poison means highly toxic, do not eat. Basically, you will be not happy if you ingest this product. So the signal words is very important. First aid statements, we talked about these, just generally tell you what to do in case you get something contacted on you. We have precautionary statements. This is where you'll find, environmental hazard statements. Your personal protective equipment can be found in this section of the label. Specific hazards to humans or domestic animals, and kind of, physical hazards that you have to be aware of. Something's flammable, things like that. So your directions for use really will lay out will really lay out how much to apply, how you can apply it, your timings, and your labeled pests, and any specific instructions for that scenario. So just always make sure you're reading and following all directions on the label, of course. Agricultural use requirements will talk about your restricted entry interval timing, and it will talk about your specific personal protective equipment that is required if you are an early entry worker. We're just going to talk briefly here about personal protective equipment. We see at the top here, we have thick gloves for applications. We have coveralls. We have rubber neoprene waterproof boots here. We have a respirator. We have chemical resistant apron, and we have safety goggles there. I'm sure we're all familiar with those things. When working in a greenhouse, you really got to take in consideration that you're working in an enclosed space. At least with cannabis greenhouses where I have a lot of experience, you're working in narrow rows that are probably taller than your head. So if you're applying by hand, I've used a dram sprayer a lot with a long hose. You're really walking up and down every row. It's a personal process. You're getting familiar with the plants, you're rubbing up against them. So you really have to be cognizant about how you're going about spraying to not be contacting the material. And sometimes you will be touching a plant that's been sprayed or has some residue on it. So you really just probably want to wear, your waterproof suit with a hood. That's kind of how I always preferred to spray. I wear thick rubber gloves on the outside. That meets all my DPR requirements. Wearing some thin rubber gloves on the inside sometimes it's just easier in case you have something in your other glove or whatnot. You have an extra layer of protection underneath. And waterproof boots, you're going to have stuff dripping on you. You're going to be walking around on wet floors. It's always just good to protect yourself properly. Different gloves are required for different materials. And we have some instructions here on care for your reusable gloves. Basically, never wear a damaged resistant glove is the most important thing to say. If it's damaged, get rid of it, cut it in half. Don't let someone else use it or put it on thinking it's still usable. All right, here we have some respirators and some eye protection. This is really focused on the eye protection here. You need to be wearing glasses with side shields if you're wearing glasses, or splash resistant goggles and face shields. Depending on what you're applying, always follow whatever is in the label as far as required personal protective equipment. Your employer must provide you with PPE, and you should always inspect your PPE to make sure that it is not there's no damage to it, and you want it to be in working order. And your employer must provide a clean place to store your PPE away from pesticides and never take home any PPE that has been used, especially now during COVID. Personal protective equipment. This is basically your employer has to clean and store the PPE at the end of the day. Your PPE must be stored separately from all personal clothing or other protective items. Do not store your PPE where you store your pesticides or any pesticide contaminated areas. Always wash your PPE separately from anything else, and make sure the person who cleans or launders the PPE knows it might be contaminated with pesticides. Respirator protection. This is super important in a greenhouse. Respiratory protection, super important in a greenhouse, confined space, you're breathing the same air. You have to have a written respirator program, which has various components. I'll let you look them up on your own, but basically whoever's wearing a respirator has to have a medical evaluation, a respirator training, and a respirator fit test. It must be a NOSHA approved respirator. So typically, higher end, nice respirators. There's a lot of stuff on China now. On Amazon that's from China and not approved by NOSHA. I've seen that in the past where people will try to use that because it only costs $20 for a full face respirator. But at the end of the day, those products are not held to the same standards as something that has been approved. So just make sure you always have an approved respirator. Your lungs are very important. Heat stress. So this is what I always like to end on, especially in a greenhouse presentation. Sometimes heat stress can be just as dangerous as pesticide exposure. Really, when you're in a greenhouse, quite often you're turning off the exhaust fans, you're changing the airflow while you're applying things. So if you're suited up in that environment, it's hot, it's humid, it's really easy to raise your body temperature very quickly. So always drink lots of water before. Make sure your coworkers know that you expect to come out in 30 minutes. If you don't come out of that zone, that someone might have to come get you. Make sure you're all right. Always drink plenty of water. Get lots of rest. Don't go in there if you're tired, fatigued, hungover. Any way that you can reduce the likelihood of heat stress, that is your best friend. You can see this ice vest right here. I've been known to actually go out and buy my own ice vest in the past, although your employer should be providing ice vests for you if you're working in a greenhouse, something like that. You really need a way to limit your heat stress. Ice vests work extremely well if you're wearing, your rubber suit coveralls, things like that. You can't breathe, you need that cooling somehow. I'm a big fan of ice vests, in case you guys can't tell. But yeah, that pretty much sums up my talk here, and I'll turn it back over to Angela. And I think we might have another Olo clip for you guys.
Yes, awesome. Thanks, Nick, so much for all that good information and the pictures. And for those of you that are still hanging on for the webinar, we appreciate that you're doing that. And I hope this information was helpful. So if you have any feedback on this portion of the presentation, please let us know. Hopefully it's a good tool to remind you of the important protocols to follow, and maybe it's giving you some good ideas of ways to improve your personal protection equipment and safety programs in your business. So with that, we're going to finish up our webinar right at 1 o'clock Pacific. So if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A. We'll take just a few minutes to go through any last question and answer after we give away this last Olo clip. Okay, so please post your questions in the Q&A. And our last question I'm going to ask, so get ready to put this in the chat, right? For the giveaway, you want to post in the chat, and you want to make sure to post to everyone, so the panelists and all participants. So the question is, what does REI stand for? What does REI stand for? So it looks like people are starting to respond, I think. There we go. So it's restricted entry interval. Okay. So I'll let my colleagues identify who the first one is to respond. And we'll send you the Olo clip. And if you want to earn more Olo clips, we have one more webinar before the holidays. It's going to be tomorrow, 11 a.m. Pacific, and it's on cannabis production. So if any of you are interested in cannabis production, or perhaps you know somebody that is, please let them know about it. We'll be giving some Olo clips away tomorrow as well. So you can join us if you'd like. All right, with that, I'm just going to go ahead and put it to the last slide so you guys can see the course codes. And did I put there we go, the course codes. And just a reminder that I will be following up in an email later today or tomorrow with the webinar quiz. The California DPR folks, you'll need to take that quiz, pass at a 70% pass rate. Please know our certificates are not automatically generated, okay? So I'm literally manually creating certificates for you all. So just bear with me. You'll receive your certificates by December 22nd. If you are on a tighter timeline, and please only if you are truly on a tighter timeline, email me. Let me know what your timeline is. I'll make sure to drop everything as soon as I can and get those certificates to you. I certainly don't want you to run into any problems with your recertification. We will submit the list of attendees to the Oregon and Washington Department of Agriculture. Lois, my colleague up in the Pacific Northwest, does that, so you shouldn't have to worry about that. But anyway, you'll expect a follow-up email from me, not from Zoom. Zoom is just a quick thank you for attending our webinar, but you'll receive a follow-up email from me that includes a copy of this presentation, recording of the webinar, and then the quiz that you must take, okay? And with that, we've got a few questions in here. I'm just gonna go and then we'll wrap up. Okay, videos are very good. Only more info on rates can be added. Okay, thank you for that, Marianne, appreciate that. Here's a question from Johnny. Which microorganisms are put in the soil besides Trichoderma and Bacillus complex? Matt or Steve, are you able to answer that one?
There's also Streptomyces lidicus, is a common one. There's an awful lot of bacillus, Bacillus pumilus, subtilis. I can see all the names, but there's an awful lot of different bacteria that are on that list as well. Those are the common ones.
Excellent. Matt, do you have anything to add there?
No, that's all good.
Okay, great.
We have Pam in the chat saying, and Pseudomonas as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick. Okay, another question. Do you feel additional product efficacy is achieved in an enclosed production system compared to open field spray applications? Steve or Matt?
Sorry, do you feel additional product efficacy is achieved in an enclosed production system compared to an open field spray applications? I don't know. That's a really good question. I mean, I think there's some semantics there, but anytime you're an indoor environment, you have better coverage and control over your spraying. So yeah, typically indoors you'll have a better control rate. But you know, and of course the ones that are outside, usually when you're spraying outdoors, a lot of these products are systemic and a lot hotter, you know, a lot more efficacious in certain areas. But you know, so there's a big difference between conventional pesticides and biologicals.
And you do get to use foggers indoors, and for materials that are fogger friendly. What a difference.
Okay, excellent. And then just to verify, Regalia and Venerate are compatible, correct?
Yes, they are tank mix friendly.
Awesome. Okay. And I think that, let's make sure okay, I think we have all the questions. If there are any other questions out there, please post them in the Q&A now. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Colleagues, if there's anything in the chat that I should be aware of or we need to announce before, let me know, because I can't get to it all at the same time here. So again, just a reminder, look for that follow-up email, take that quiz by the end of the week if you can, so that we can get you your certificates by December 22nd. And of course, if you have any feedback or suggestions for future webinars, please let us know. We're always looking to be a good source of information and education for the industry on biologicals. And stay tuned for mid-January, where we'll do a follow-up webinar, more videos to come, and the focus will be on insect management in the greenhouse operation. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to my speakers, to Steve, to Matt, to Nick, and my colleagues Lois and John for being on as resources. And if we don't see you or talk to you again, we wish you a very happy and peaceful holiday season. And hopefully we'll see you all on our webinar in January. So take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.